and for the people of Ukraine and all of the surrounding countries over there. We hope that conflict ends soon. With that, I will turn it over to Safwat. Look forward to having you once again.
Thank you, Drake.
Take care.
Good morning, everyone. It's wonderful with you again this week. And we will continue to reflect on the biblical traditions and what they invite us to think about and consider as we think about the witness of the church in a time where we are, as a faith community, are called to embody an alternative in the world around us, showing and embodying God's love to those who are different from us and living into God's vision for God's creation and the church, as well as a body of believers who come from different backgrounds, different linguistic backgrounds, cultural backgrounds, and so on. So last week, we talked about migration, in which the host and the migrant in the Joseph narrative kind of fulfill each other's dreams as they work together, as they express their vulnerability to each other, and also as they receive the other as a gift from God. Today, we will think about the other side of this question. So most of the conversation around migration in relation to the Bible and the church has focused around the question of welcoming the stranger and thinking about border and thinking about the hospitality that can be shown to those who are vulnerable and those who are forced to migrate. But then there is another question that I think the Bible is putting before us as we think about the question of migration in relation to the life of the church. And us as Christians who take the Bible seriously and who feel called to embody God's vision of shalom, of peace and justice in the world. What are we doing about those who are different among us? So it's not just about welcoming the stranger, it's also about whom are we called to be as individuals, as churches, and as communities, given the diversity that we see around us. Cultural diversity, linguistic diversity, theological diversity. So this is not just about how the country looks like. This is also about what the church looks like. My experiences as an individual look like in workspaces and in the neighborhoods where we live. So this is an invitation for us to consider this idea that God is calling us as a church to remember the Pentecost, where the gospel was proclaimed in many languages. God is calling us to remember this beautiful vision that we see in the book of Revelation, where John sees the church made up of people who speak different languages, come from different tribes, come from different peoples. So the question then that we are confronted with, what happened to this memory of the Pentecost? Has the Pentecost and its vision just became one day that we celebrate annually and we kind of move on to how we do things? Or is the vision of John, this is just a futuristic, beautiful image that does not really shape or influence the present of what God is calling us to be and do as a faith community, given the diversities that we experience in our lives as individuals, as congregations, and also as a nation and as a world, as we encounter those who are different from us. And I call that God is calling us to live into the vision of an intercultural church. And it's possible that these waves of migration are now reminding us that there is something in scriptures. It's as old as the writings of the Old Testament and the New Testament, where God's vision for God's people is to embrace difference. That difference is not a threat. That difference is not something that is questioning who I am, but rather it's a divine gift for whom we are called to be as a church, as individuals, and as a Christian community that seeks to embody something that is helping the communities around us to experience God's shalom. So an intercultural church or Christians who are able to navigate relationships in which there is sameness, there is a common ground, but also there is difference. Christians and the church that is called to embrace this difference as a gift. So if we could even go back to 1960, this is a quote from Martin Luther King Jr.'s interview that he conducted on April 17th, 1960. And he says these words: "I think it is one of the tragedies of our nation, one of the shameful tragedies, that 11 o'clock on Sunday morning is one of the most segregated hours, if not the most segregated hours in Christian America. I definitely think the Christian church should be integrated, and any church that stands against integration and that has a segregated body is standing against the spirit and the teaching of Jesus Christ, and it fails to be a true witness." So these words here, Martin Luther King Jr. is highlighting some of the reality that the church experiences in light of the biblical vision that is found in the book of Acts, in Pentecost, and also in the book of Revelation, where there is integration and celebration of difference. So when we talk about an intercultural church, we need to ask ourselves, what is a culture? A culture can have many meanings and lots of complex ones, but one of the definitions that I like and appreciate because of its simplicity is that a culture is a product of, and it also reinforces shared knowledge and patterns of behavior that help navigating the society that one lives in. And another simple definition, a culture is the way we do things. So the way we do worship, the way we do fellowship, the way we do witness, the way we conduct ourselves as a faith community, as individuals, as families who live in neighborhoods, and as a Christian community. So how do we do worship? How do we do witness? How do we envision what it means to be a church? That is part of the culture that we produce and also reinforce, and we accept as stable, and we accept as this is the only way to do church. This is the only way to do worship. This is the only way we do witness. This is the only way we do fellowship. It's a culture that we produce, but also reinforce. But then if we are thinking about change and transformation as a church, then we need to examine that. We need to examine what we have taken for granted. We need to examine what we have assumed to be stable. If we look around us in our societies, in our workspaces, in our familiar relations, if we look at our neighborhoods, if we look at our churches, we might find some of these patterns. The first pattern is an assumed monoculture, an assumed monoculture. And the reason I say it's assumed, because if we look deeply into our families, if we look deeply into our churches, even if they look monocultural, they are not. Because there are differences that maybe have been repressed, maybe different theologies, maybe different ways of thinking about worship, maybe different ways of thinking about the Bible, maybe different ways of thinking about God, maybe different ways of thinking about how we should witness as a church. So sometimes we may look like we are a monoculture, maybe because most of us come from a majority of ethnic background or a racial background or socioeconomic background. But if we look deeply at our congregations that may look like they are monocultural, they are diverse. Maybe diverse in their theologies. Maybe they are not as diverse ethnically, but they are diverse theologically. Maybe they are not as diverse in terms of cultural and linguistic backgrounds, but they are different and diverse in the sense of how the people who worship in the same space see the world differently, see politics differently. But sometimes because of an assumed unity, we kind of don't know how to create spaces for those differences and to celebrate them and to enjoy them. Sometimes there are communities that can be called multicultural, where there is a sense of celebration of diversity, but people don't really get to know each other at a deeper level. Like there could be some racial or ethnic or linguistic diversity, maybe socioeconomic diversities, but there is no intentional space in which people are actually spending time together to know these differences, to know the story of every family, to know the story of those who are around us, who might be thinking theologically, politically, and about the world and the ministry of the church differently. So in a multicultural setting, there is a recognition of difference, but it's kind of like creating islands. Each group that can get along, that they know each other to have the same political opinion, they kind of know each other and they kind of create their own in-group. Those who have a different background theologically and they kind of like lean together towards a particular theology, they have their own kind of in-group within the same faith community. There is an acceptance of difference. It's not like people are condemning each other or refusing to worship with one another. They do, but there is no intentional space in creating a common space, a common conversation where we can come together and say things to each other in ways that show love, but also acceptance of difference. So we have assumed monoculture and then multicultural, and then we have an intercultural space. An intercultural space is a space where people don't only respect difference and accept it, but people celebrate difference. People welcome that difference and find ways to be enriched by these differences. Tell me about your story. Tell me about your faith journey. Tell me how you have come to know God in this way. Tell me how your socioeconomic experiences have shaped who you are. Tell me how your political views shape the way you see the church and its witness. In that intercultural space, even though people may look alike or may have a shared background, they are not only able to find those differences and celebrate them and welcome them, but they create intentional spaces in which they actually talk about them, so that we become enriched. Not differences that we want to brush under the rug because they seem to threaten our unity and our coming together to worship God as one body, but to actually create spaces in which we give thanks to God for those differences, in which we actually walk together these faith journeys and become enriched by these differences. This is a shameless self-promotion. This is the title of my book on intercultural church, where I want or suggest that we are called by the Spirit as faith communities who live in the 21st century in North America to embrace the differences that has been going on in our world, in our society for a long time, and to see it as a gift and to see an invitation for us to build covenantal communities in which differences are received as a gift, not as a threat, and boundaries are not rigid, in which we are willing as a faith community, as individuals who participate in the body of this covenantal community, to be open, to spend time intentionally to know one another, to be transformed by these relationships. So the church in this way is not a place where I go on Sunday morning worship and leave, or come in the middle of the week to do a Bible study and leave. It's a community that we are invested in, through which we are transformed, in which we become open to know and to be known by those with whom we worship. Boundaries are not rigid, but rather porous and mutually negotiated. Because in an intercultural church where we celebrate difference, there will be difference in power. There will be difference in privilege. There will be difference in experiences. You name whatever kind of difference we're thinking about, either in sexual orientation, gender, racial background, ethnic background, linguistic background, socioeconomic backgrounds, there is sometimes power differential. So when we are embracing those differences, when we are being open to being transformed with one another through this encounter and through this covenantal relationship, we also realize power difference. And we use that power for the sake of the other. And we use that power in order to help in integration and in empowering one another. When individuals and groups in the church learn how to claim and to be critical of who they are, this is something really significant about building an intercultural church, is that when I enter these relationships or intercultural communities and neighborhoods and workspaces, or even familiar relations, that I become self-critical of who I am. So I don't take my worldview just for granted, and everybody should believe this way, because it's my worldview. So I exercise self-critical posture even towards myself. So when I do this self-critical approach towards who I am, and when I also learn how to offer and to receive from one another, the church embodies an alternative beyond the models of assimilation and segregation. Assimilation is when we assume a particular dominant culture and say, this is our culture and everybody's welcome as long as they become like us. That's assimilation. Segregation or separation, or sometimes in a positive way, multicultural, is like, we love you and you have a great relationship with God, but how about if you just stay here and we stay here and everybody's happy? So when we try to kind of move beyond these assimilation models, you need to become like us to be welcomed, or everybody's happy if we take a corner. When we embody this relationship in which we embrace difference, find the common ground, talk to each other although we are different, love each other although we are different, empower each other to experience God's shalom although we are different, then to the world around us that's full of hatred and violence, exclusion, the church becomes not only a sermon that is great and sound, but also an embodiment of that message that is inviting the world to find God's love and to be transformed by God's love. When the church becomes an intercultural covenantal community, thus moving beyond being a monocultural or multicultural, it proclaims a message of hope in a world that is polarized and divided. So in order to do that, we need to strengthen our competency, our abilities, our skills on how to relate to people who are different from us. And one of the tools that I use sometimes in my teaching, I use it in this book in order to help people figure out a practical way to think about how they think about difference, how they think about sameness and difference, is something called Intercultural Development Inventory or Intercultural Development Continuum. And Mitchell Hammer, who developed this continuum, defines intercultural competence as the capability to accurately understand and adapt behavior to cultural difference and commonality. So it's an ability, it's a skill to find what's common and to build on it, but to also find what is different and not only accept it, but learn how to adapt to it. And that's not just one person or one group adapting, it's a mutual work. When it becomes mutual work, then it becomes intercultural. If it's the job of one only to adapt, then it becomes assimilation, because people are just leaving their culture and becoming like someone else. It's a mutual relationship. So this continuum, if you look on the screen there, kind of talks about different stages of moving from being monocultural to being intercultural. It begins with a posture or an orientation known as denial. Denial is an orientation where people may recognize the cultural differences in terms of food, clothing, but then they do not think that there are deep cultural differences when it comes to values, when it comes to how people see the world. So we might recognize that someone is different from us because they speak a different language or eat different food and so on. But then how do they think about time? And how the way they think about time is different from my Western way of thinking about time. How do people think about cultural difference when it comes to conflict resolution? Some are confrontational, some are not. Those are the deep values. It's like the iceberg, where you see a top one, that's the clothing and the language and the food, but then the deep, big part, which are the values. Then there is polarization. In polarization, people think about the world of us versus them. We are here, and these are our values, and this is who they are, and these are their values. And that could happen in two different ways, this polarization. We are better than them. We got the right theology. We got the right politics. We got the right ways of thinking about the world. We got the right way to worship. We got like us versus them, but we are better than them. Then there is the opposite, where it's called reversal polarization, where people who are from less dominant culture, they also say, well, your culture is way better than us, or the way you think about this business is way better than the way I think about it. And sometimes it happens by people who come from the less dominant culture because they think about it in the way of move along to come along. Like just accept it, because if I speak up, I might not get my promotion. And we see that in our workspaces. We see that in our neighborhoods. We see that sometimes even within our churches. So this idea of polarization is really based on us versus them. Then we move along the continuum, and there is minimization. In minimization, we use language like, we are all humans, right? Like we all believe in one God. In minimization, we try to find the common ground because we don't want to talk about difference. Because if we talk about difference, we are afraid that then we're going to cause disharmony and conflict. I think minimization is helpful in finding a common ground with people who are different. But it's not helpful if then we stop there. Because what happens is that we assume that what we have taken for granted and our norms should be shared by everybody. Moving along the continuum after minimization, there is acceptance, which is like the multicultural community or church, where there is an acceptance of difference, but not a lot of integration, not a lot of getting to know those who are different, not a lot of adaptation, not a lot of change to be able to be with other people who are different from us. But then the final orientation, and it's not a hierarchy, it's a journey. It's a walk that we all develop. It's not like a recipe to kind of like work on these competencies. It's actually about encountering people who are different and learning how to navigate those spaces. Mm. So sometimes, you know, I encounter people, and some people ask me, so what's your name? And I tell them my name. My name is Safwat, and it's like, yeah, it's so hard to know because they are not familiar with. So I actually tell them, no, it's not that hard. And you know what? I will spell it for you, and I will make sure you're able to say it. So this way, I am refusing to settle for, well, you know, if your name is James, then I will say it. I do that at Starbucks. I do that when I order, and I spell my name and make sure they get to know it. And I don't do it because I just want to like give them a hard time, or I just want to show them that they are like choosing not to know people who are different. I am doing it because if we not do these things, then people will just keep on normalizing the culture they know. And if we do these little things, then we show a posture of, I am showing hospitality in this minimum space, and I can also show hospitality in this big space. Because sometimes we talk about hospitality as like these grand projects that we can do as churches, and sometimes we're not willing to work with the very small ones of, what does your name mean? Why were you named Safwat? Why were you named this? What language do you speak in Egypt? Right? Like asking these questions. And sometimes we become afraid of stepping on people's toes. So we're kind of like afraid to say the offensive things. So we actually don't get to know each other. There is risk in intercultural relations. There is risk when we encounter difference. I'm not saying like just go there and say the offensive things and like people will just accept it. No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying it's okay to be careful, but let's not let fear control the relationships of actually encountering people who are different. And we could start with small things and then move to a bigger thing. We could begin by asking people about their names, what they mean, what's their cultural background, what are their favorite food, why is that their favorite food, what kind of cultural values they have. Think about like when you do like a meeting and you say, you know, here are the tasks that we have to do, and you jump right into it, and you have other people from different cultures that care about relationships more than they care about the tasks, and they feel rushed and they have to be squeezed into the meeting and its agenda without them feeling like I related to that person on a personal level. Like these deep cultural layers then come when we actually step out of our culture and start to wonder, how do you do that? How do you think about that? What are your thoughts about this? So these aspects of adaptation may at first feel like they are pulling us back because there's a lot of learning to do, but then eventually we find that we are at a deeper level of relationships with people who are different, and also an encounter of God in a new way because we have allowed ourselves to step out of our assumed, accepted norm into someone else's world in which they have been enriched, raised, and they understand the world in a different way. And they are also coming into this relationship, not that I assimilate into their world, but that we together can envision something new. That we together can envision, how do we worship? How do we think about fellowship? How do we think about the witness of the church? How do we think about God? And so on. So given that I'm a Bible scholar, can we hold the questions? I promise I will leave some time.
Do you want one yet?
Yeah, I will. Let's.
When you're ready for it.
Yeah, let's hold them, please. So if we look at the biblical traditions, there are lots of stories that talk about people who are different. They encounter each other. One of my favorite stories that I go to in order to think and flesh out some of these things that we looked at, like sociological and anthropological lenses now. But how do we bring this to the Bible, into our faith spaces as a Christian community? So the story of Peter and Cornelius in Acts chapter 10. It begins with this Gentile, a representative of the Roman Empire, Cornelius, who is a God-fearer. And, you know, he gives alms and he prays. And while he was praying, an angel of the Lord appeared to him and told him, you're accepted by God. Send to Peter in Joppa and bring him here, and he will tell you what you need to do. Meanwhile, when Cornelius sent people over to Joppa to get Peter, who is a Jew, follower of Jesus, Peter was hungry, and he had a vision 3 times of a blanket, of a sheet that has creatures of all kinds, clean and unclean. And God tells Peter 3 times, get up and eat. And Peter says, no, Lord, because I have never eaten unclean animals. So he's following the purity laws. I have never eaten unclean animals 3 times. And he was perplexed by the vision. The messengers of Cornelius arrive, and the Spirit tells Peter, go down to meet your guests. He meets them. He knows why they are there. They stay overnight, and then on the next day, they head to Caesarea where Cornelius is. When Peter goes there, you have this encounter between a Gentile and a Jew. Cornelius, who is representative of the power of the Roman Empire, kneels to the ground and bows before Peter, who's a marginalized Jew in this kind of imperial context. And Peter raises him up and tells him, I'm a human being. And then Cornelius tells him, about the vision. And Peter tells him, I don't know why I'm here. You tell me. And then Cornelius tells him the vision, asks him, so what did the Lord tell you to tell me? And Peter starts to preach the sermon. And before Cornelius and his family come to the pulpit and proclaim Jesus as Lord, the Spirit comes down on them. And those who are circumcised Christians, like from a Jewish background, see the Spirit comes down on the Gentile ones. And they are shocked. And they celebrate and they sit together and eat. Christians of Jewish background and Christians of Gentile background. So when you look at this story in relation to this continuum that we talked about, Peter tells Cornelius once they encounter each other, it's unlawful for me as a Jew to be with you as a Gentile. This is a representation of one worldview. We should not generalize it on all Judaism and all Jews. This is one worldview here that the author of Acts is trying to show some sort of the beginning of the church as it welcomes Gentiles within it. But clearly in the story, there is a boundary. There is a boundary that separates Peter and Cornelius. And that boundary is crossed. There are people who are different, who may, in other circumstances, might not have imagined to be together in one space. And because of the work of God and the Spirit and the centrality of the gospel, they were brought together. And boundaries were crossed. Difference was not lost, but at the same time, boundaries were crossed. And they were able to build this intercultural church within the beginning of the story of the church in the book of Acts. So one of the cornerstones and blocks that this story reminds us as a church today is that the church, whatever we call it, whatever denomination it is, whatever its history, we as congregations, we are part of the church, capital C, the invisible church. That is, after all, it's God's project. That in that church and for that church, God celebrates people who come from different languages, different tribal backgrounds, and different nations, and so on. It was God who appeared to Cornelius. It was the Spirit that told Peter. It was the Jesus and the gospel of Jesus that brings shalom to everyone and peace to everyone. That was the center of the sermon of Peter. And the Spirit just came down on the Gentiles. No conditions, no requests, no come to Jesus moment, no walk to the pulpit moment. The Spirit just freely came down on the Gentiles. So one important aspect to remember when we think about whom God is calling us to be is that however we worship, however our culture is in our congregation and the church, we need to be reminded that after all, this church that we are part of, that we are invested in, is not ours. It's God's project. And that unity then can bring people who are different. That unity then reminds me it's not about how I see what kind of songs we should sing in the church, or how we should worship, or how we should sit even in the church. Yeah, my culture is embraced, but it's not the center of what it means to be a church. The center of what it means to be a church is God. And that's the common ground that brings us. God's freedom, the centrality of the gospel of Jesus, and the freedom of the Spirit. Another important brick in building this church is that the need was mutual. This is similar to what we saw in the Joseph and Pharaoh story. Both Peter and Cornelius have a piece of the puzzle, but they need each other to understand what God is doing in the world. Peter walks in and tells him, tell me why you brought me here. Cornelius tells him, tell me what the Spirit, what the Lord told you to say to us. So when we walk into the church, it's not that I got God figured out. When we walk into the church and think about its ministry and its witness, it's not that I am the only one who knows what God is up to in the world and how God should work. The need is mutual, and that brings vulnerability, but also brings enrichment by encountering those who are different. The third brick that we see in this story is that conversion is mutual. As I said in that continuum, the last one was adaptation. And for adaptation to work right, that means that we all are willing to be changed and transformed. Peter, who realized that the vision, after all, was not about what he was about to eat. It was about people. God showed me that I should not say this is clean and this is unclean. This is welcomed and this is unwelcomed. He realized his humanity. He told Cornelius, get up, I am a human being. I'm merely a human. I'm not God. And Cornelius, the representative of the empire, kneels before this marginalized Jew, wanting to be transformed as he encounters the gospel of Christ. The fourth one is that fellowship is vital. Food is central in the story. It began with Peter's vision about food, his hunger, and it ends with the Gentiles and the Jews eating together and having a fellowship together. So let's imagine us getting together. I know the pandemic has kind of shaped these practices in ways that are not helpful. But hopefully, as we reclaim a new normal, if we could eat together, cook together, invite people who come from different backgrounds and different ethnic backgrounds, and not only just eat diverse cuisine, but also cook together, learn about the stories, how people have come to be who they are today. Around food, when people tell their stories, we can create sacred spaces in which and through which we can actually start to build deeper relationships. Lots of stories in the Bible have to do with food and encountering people who are different. Isaac and the Philistines in Genesis 26. Ruth and Boaz in the book of Ruth. You could look at tons of stories in the stories of Jesus in the gospel. They all have to do with food, and they all have to do with breaking boundaries and flipping who is the host and who is the guest. So this is an invitation to enjoy food, but enjoy it with people who are different from us, creating spaces for us to encounter one another at a deeper level. The last brick is healthy boundaries are necessary. So getting together and building an intercultural church and encountering difference is not about loss of boundaries. Because let's be honest, we all as humans need boundaries. Sometimes we need boundaries so that we just remain put because we're invading other people's boundaries. But sometimes we need boundaries to feel safe. But it's about boundary crossing, because if I build tight boundaries and rigid boundaries, and I don't let myself be vulnerable and enjoy others or let others into my life, then we are not really taking steps towards building a faith community that celebrates and integrates difference. So it's not about loss of boundaries. It's about finding a way through which we can negotiate these boundaries together and be transparent about them rather than just operate around them without being explicit about them. We see this in the story of Peter and Cornelius, because at the end, it says that the Christians who come from a circumcised background recognize that the Spirit came on those who were uncircumcised. So difference is clearly recognized. It's not that people lost who they are. Same thing in the vision of John in the book of Revelation. You can still tell that there are people who come from different backgrounds, different linguistic backgrounds, different national backgrounds. You could still see difference. But difference is not a threat. It's a gift. Boundaries are not tight. Boundaries are crossed. I will stop here so that we can have about 5 minutes for questions and answer them.
We do have 5 minutes left, but I've got one.
Go ahead. That.
But I need that.
Oh, yeah. You do. Sorry.
Mine, no, mine. We're going to need a 50-minute class to deal with this next one, but should we make a distinction between embracing diversity and embracing mass migration of troubled people? Is removing large populations from the lands of their birth a Christian solution to the world's most distressing problems? If we can agree that open borders are not practical, where do we draw the line on immigration?
Yeah, again, this question has to keeps asking about the legality of migration, and I do care about the legal aspect of migration, but it's not. It's like I want to press back and say we have diversities around us. So what are we doing about it? So I do care about the question about the legal aspect, but now if we look around, if we get out of our houses, our neighborhood, and drive around in Richmond and ask, what are we doing about those who are in our midst? That's my goal, the goal of my presentation today. So if we bring back the question about legality to talk about this, then we are not listening to what we are called to be thinking about here and now. That's a question for another time to think about. So what I'm interested in is, let's put the legality question on the side for a second and get out of our houses, our neighborhoods, and look at the neighborhoods around us and our congregations and our churches. What are we doing towards those who are different from us, who are present in our midst? How are we showing generosity? How are we getting to know them rather than just always point down south?
Hold what down?
Right there. You don't have to hold it right. It'll pick you up.
Can you comment on, in terms of differences, how different religions address what you're talking about, the acceptance of intercultural diversity, and beyond that being a comparative religion question, what Christianity could learn from other religions?
Yeah, thank you. So there are, let's say if we look at one or other faith traditions, we will find streams within each faith tradition. Same thing like when we look at Christianity, we will find Christian traditions that are pluralistic, that are open towards who are different, and also Christian streams that are exclusionary and exclusive. Same thing about any other faith traditions that we encounter around us. So let's say if we look at the Islamic tradition, for example, you will find traditions that are pluralistic. They find aspects in the Quran to advocate for diversity and acceptance of different faiths and different backgrounds and different cultures. You will find exclusionary traditions within Islam about that. So it's really important when we look at a faith tradition, we remember that these faith traditions themselves are diverse. There are within these faith traditions different streams, different theological streams that are akin and similar to the streams that we find within Christianity. And with those who are, if we are embracing pluralism and welcoming difference and celebrating difference, with those who are also celebrating these differences, we can find common ground in order, hopefully, to change all these exclusionary and exclusivist approaches within Christianity or outside of Christianity. On the point about encountering other faith traditions and learning from them, I think, at least my approach, is it's really important to remember that any true interreligious encounter means that I am grounded in my faith. So it doesn't mean, like, if in order to do interreligious encounter, it doesn't mean that I give up my Christian faith and give up differences in order to actually have fellowship with those who practice Judaism or Islam or don't have any religion at all. I can be grounded in my faith, but at the same time open to learning, to grow by encountering how my Jewish neighbors, my Muslim neighbors, my Hindu neighbors think about God and think about their spirituality. Maybe finding a common ground, but at the same time, being explicit about difference doesn't mean that we start to hate each other or create a hierarchy of who is better, who got it right. What truth can they offer that would enrich my spirituality, and what truth that I can offer that I hope would enrich their spirituality? That's the approach that I hope we can embrace and think about.
Any more questions? From the floor or on Zoom?
Growing up in Egypt, what was the comparison? What was the comparison of Christians versus other religions, and how did that interaction affect your childhood and early development?
Yeah, thank you. Egypt is about, depends on whom you ask. If you ask the state, Christians about 10%. If you ask the church, mostly the Coptic Orthodox Church, Christians about 15% of the population. Egypt is about 105 million now. So Egypt has the largest Christian community in North Africa and the Middle East. The predominant denomination among Christians is the Coptic Orthodox, and the Presbyterian Church started about 150 years or so by American missionaries, actually. So my grandmother was, so I grew up as a Christian, so it's not like I'm a convert, because Christians can trace themselves back to the early centuries of Christianity. But my grandmother was Coptic Orthodox. So I grew up in an ecumenical setting, but also an interreligious setting. An interreligious setting that sometimes experience minoritization, in the sense that Christians are a minority in Egypt. The Egyptian constitution says Egypt is a Muslim state, even though Sharia law is not applied. It's mostly like French law and civil law. But there are things that have to do with gender, things that have to do with inheritance. They go back to the Sharia law because it gives a privilege to men. So, you know, like in any patriarchal culture, whatever can support patriarchy, they will appeal to it, whether from civil law or religious law. But I grew up around difference. So I grew up around difference within the Christian traditions. So within my family and within my home village, encountering people who think about God differently within the Coptic Orthodox Church and the Presbyterian Church. And also when we go to schools, we had religious education in schools. So Muslims would have their religious education and Christians would have the religious education separately once or twice a week. So I grew up around difference, but it was not always done in a way that is healthy. It was sometimes antagonistic, minoritization. I hold the truth more than you do, and lots of polemics. So this is why I care about this work, because it's in some ways different from the background that I have experienced, where there's a lot of antagonism and a lot of polemical approaches towards others' faith, trying to belittle them or show that they are not truthful, or to attack them or minoritize people, or even try to survive by saying, well, no, you do not hold the truth either, right? So this is why I care about this work of difference, because I have seen the impact of relationships that are just based on seeing difference as a threat.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, Arnold, can we save your question until next week? Or,
Yeah, we're a few minutes over.
Yeah.
It's almost over.
or you can send it to me on email, Arnold, and I'll address it next week. All right. Thank you, Safwat. Very interesting discussion. Huge topic that
Thank you all.
deserves more conversation.
Yes.
But Rebecca Weaver will be with us next week. Safwat is going on vacation, so we're giving him 1 week off. And then he's coming back on April the 10th to finish up his classes with us. But Rebecca Weaver is here next week. Thanks for coming all. Appreciate it. Good to see y'all on
Thank you all.
Zoom.